Well, we're going to explore crime and criminal justice this week, and oh gosh, it's not a fun topic, but I think you're going to really learn a lot from it about particularly the sociological perspective on this issue, because it's completely different than anybody else's. I'll tell you, any other discipline about it. Certainly different from psychology and most of criminal justice and that type of thing. So, first, we're going to look at it as I said, from a sociological perspective. So, the first thing we're going to explore is what is crime? How do we think about crime? How do we come to the conclusions we do about crime and the definitions we do? And the first thing to understand uh, sociologically is that it's socially constructed, which means, of course, that it varies. It varies from country to country. It varies within our country. And here are some examples, okay, to prove that it's socially constructed. In Florida, it's illegal to sell alcohol before 1 o'clock on a Sunday. In Arkansas, school teachers who cut their hair short can't get a raise. Now, some of these may have been changed since this book text was first written. I don't know. In California, animals cannot have sex within 1,500 feet of a church. In New York, women can be topless in public as long as they do not profit from it. And in Texas, you'll break the law if you sell your eye, apparently. Almost all states have very dumb laws. So, what this illustrates is the essential nature of crime is that no activity is criminal in and of itself. Is really only criminal if it's defined as criminal in whatever society or state you live in or culture, right? So crime is a violation of laws. If there's no law, there's no crime. The relativity of crime, then, is it true and what are its implications? Well, the first is that crime is culturally relative. Laws differ from one society to another, as I've said. So eating pork or drinking alcohol is illegal in some Muslim societies, whereas in those same societies, polygamy is legal and in the preferred form of marriage. Laws can change in the same country as they have in many countries, including our own. So in China, people making a profit during the communist, really extreme communist era, people making a profit were called profiteers, and they were criminals. That was against the law to profiteer, and it was punished by death. It was a pretty intense punishment. But when China moved to a capitalist economy in the 1990s, there was no longer a crime, right? And some of the profiteers who hadn't gotten caught as profiteers and put to death are now had joined the Communist Party and are leaders. What about marijuana laws? Boy, have they changed, right? In some states it's legal now, and in other states it isn't. But you could be thrown in jail for a very long time for possession, a very small amount of marijuana historically. What about teaching slaves to read in the South? That was illegal at one time. So the relativity of crime is so extreme that something that was once a crime can actually be encouraged. And the example the text gives is birth control, okay, which was completely illegal for a long time. Making something criminal is a political process. It's political because it has to be put into law, and it's politicians that create laws, and that's why it's political. Abortion before 1973 was illegal, and it could very well be again. So you're seeing that political process work its way through here. It has to be voted on by Congress, right? So it's a political process. So there's two principles that devolves from this. The first is that the law defines what crime is in whatever, once again, country or culture you're in or state, that crime is the outcome of a political process. And that leads us to power. Who decides these things? Okay. And power is is defined as being able to achieve your goals despite resistance. What groups have the power to get their views written into law? We're seeing that play out right now again with the abortion issue. Okay. How do they get authorities to pass laws? Why do some societies ignore behaviors that others punish? Drugs are an example. And the summary of all of those questions is, whose interests do the laws reflect? Now we're going to look at the scope. So, and that is a key question to keep in your mind through this whole chapter. Whose interests do the laws reflect? Now we're going to look at the scope of the problem and crime as a social problem, because this class is social problems, right? So crime has to have been defined already as a social problem. First, you have to look at the criminal justice system and analyze that a little bit, and the agencies that respond to crime, which are the police, the courts, jails, prisons, and parole systems. And so how extensive is crime? Well, consider the amount of crime in the US, where it's incredibly extensive, unfortunately. And these statistics are once again a year or two old, so they're different now. 16,000 murdered each year, 90,000 raped, 400,000 robbed, 1 million cars stolen, 2 million homes broken into. And even though the crime rates dropped in the past 30 years, it's rising again due to the epidemic and that type of thing, but it has been dropping dramatically. The US crime rate remains so high that each year 4 out of 100 people in the United States are victims of crime. The US rates of rape and murder, and we learned about that in the last chapter with rape, are higher than those of other countries. And the same is true for burglary, theft, and robbery and other crimes. Why is crime so universal? Remember that objective conditions are not enough to make a social problem. People have to be concerned and view them as a problem. Remember the definition of a social problem: about which people are concerned, a problem about which people are concerned. So just a few years ago, crime was considered to be the #1 social problem in the nation, particularly in the 1990s. My gosh, it was just rampant. So let's look at this, analyzing this theoretically through the different theories of sociology. First, we're going to look at the symbolic interactionist theory. And we're going to talk about a group of kids, high school kids, called the Saints and the Roughnecks. Those were the names that the sociologists gave the groups that they studied. They weren't their own names. Okay. They were, so two groups, the Saints and the Roughnecks, the good guys and the bad guys. You can already tell from their names, right? They were all white. They all went to the same high school. They all participated in criminal acts, such as truancy, drinking while driving, petty theft, etc. But the Saints were the good kids, right? They were, quote, headed for success. They were some of the most delinquent, but they were never arrested. Okay? The bad kids were the lower class kids, right? And they actually committed fewer criminal acts. But guess who got busted all the time? Why were they so perceived so differently? It was social class and styles of interaction. So I want to explain this a little bit more to you. The upper class kids, would get called into the vice principal's office or something and be told that they were in trouble for cutting class a lot, and the Saints kid would respond by, "Oh, gee, I'm so sorry, Mr. Smith. I've been having a really hard time at home and with my girlfriend, and I just can't focus. But I swear to do better. I'll be here more often." A lot of eye contact, right? with Mr. Smith. And Mr. Smith says, well, John, I know you plan on being a doctor like your father, and you're not going to be able to get into any good college, and certainly not med school, if you don't have good grades. So it's really important that you come to class and you do your homework. Oh, yes, I understand. I'm going to do blah, 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 blah. When the Roughnecks were called into the office, just as an example, no eye contact, head down, I don't know why I don't come to class, whatever, that type of thing. So the other thing is that both Mr. Smith knows who the saints' fathers and mothers are and where they're standing in the society in that town is. And so does the cop who stops him. Say there's a cop who sees 4 teenage boys, young men, in a vehicle, and they're driving kind of erratically, and he pulls them over, and he looks and he sees, beer cans or whatever in the back of the car, and he says, hey, should we use John again? Sure, why not? No, let's use somebody else. Robert. Hey, Robert, you're driving a little weirdly here. And I can see that you've been drinking and that you have, containers in the car, empty containers in the car. So this time I'm going to give you a warning. Why? Because it's the judge's son or an attorney that he works with son. And so, the kid sitting next to him is, that doctor, John, his doctor's son, John, He knows who these kids are. He knows who their families are. And so the warning is, I want you to go straight home. I don't want you to drive over 30 miles an hour. I'm going to be right behind you all the way. The next time, there's going to be some severe consequences. Okay. Do you think that the Roughnecks first of all, most of the Roughnecks don't have cars, so they're drinking more publicly, et cetera, et cetera. But the real life, I'll end this diatribe in a moment, but the real life story for me was many, 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 many years ago. My son was at a party where there was alcohol underage, and the police came and they all got minor in possession arrests or busted or whatever, and we had to go to court. And the judge, it was a local judge here, and he didn't take any guff from anybody. And I went with my son, and actually, here's another thing about social class. When he came out to go to court with me, I don't remember what he was wearing. I was going with him, and I said, you change your clothes. Put on an actual shirt, or not a maybe it was a t-shirt or something. Put on a shirt, et cetera, et cetera. And so we go to court, and he was like, they took a whole bunch of kids before my son, and I was like, oh, geez, I didn't want to be there, but I thought, well, this is a good sociological observational opportunity. So the first kid walks up, his name is called, he walks up in front of the judge, hands in his pocket, cap over his eyes, chewing gum. What do you think the first thing the judge says to him? Lose the cap, take your hands out of the pocket, and get rid of your gum, which is kind of hard to do when you're standing up and there's nowhere to put your gum, so you had to hold it in his hand. Okay, I thought, oh, poor kid, bad impression. Then and he's going to get a harder, whatever, from the judge. The next kid comes up, and the one thing I was thinking the whole time that I was watching this drama was, well, all the other guys will know to take off their hats and stick the gum under the seats of their chairs and not have their hands in their pockets. Nope. Next one did the same thing. Well, by the time my son got up there, he looked like one of the saints, right? Eye contact with the judge, yes sir, no sir, no hands in the pockets, and it was a very different experience for him. That's the kind of things that happen when we're talking about these social class differences and how people are treated in the criminal justice system. I'm not blaming anybody, right? I want you to understand that. If anything, it should be the onus should be on the system that could throw you in jail to not have those stereotypes and reactions. But the reality is that, of course, they do, as we'll see as we move through this. So what we see here is this differential association and subcultural theories. So the first is a labeling process, and the labeling process sets people on very different paths in life. So the saints, this is from the research, right? Those boys were labeled the good guys who, who were just, acting up the way teenagers, the way adolescent males do, and the bad guys, the roughnecks. Those were the concepts. So here's what happened to them in later life as the sociologists followed up. The saints, one became a doctor, one a lawyer, one earned a PhD, and the others went into management. The roughnecks, two got athletic scholarships, two dropped out of high school and were convicted in separate killings and ended up in prison, and the whereabouts of the other two remained unknown. Now let's look at police discretion. Okay. If your taillight is out, does a policeman have to stop you? No. They can stop you or not. Right? I mean, they're probably going to, especially if you're a certain kind of person or have a certain kind of car, but it's not necessary to do that. Now, neither are plates that are, I can't remember what I'm trying to say, plates that are too old or, whatever. So here's police discretion. Discretion means who gets arrested and what are the consequences. So here's an 18-year-old white male accused of statutory rape. The girl's father was prominent in local politics. And one of the people, anyway, wanted people to take the police to take severe action. The youth was polite, sir, to police officers, etc. The sergeant became sympathetic, decided to try to get the charges dropped. Now there was another 17-year-old white male with the same crime. He wasn't polite to the officers. The officers became angry at the rudeness. Rudeness made an arrest report and took him to juvenile hall. Both men had solid evidence against them, right? The police even had political pressure to prosecute the 18-year-old, who was the son of the politician. But politeness and cooperation changed the officers' perceptions. The deference and respect put the police on his side. His deference and respect to the police officer put the police officer on his side, and it sent a powerful message. The demeanor of the 17-year-old was disrespectful, and that sent a powerful negative message. So the other thing, there's an example of I was going too fast on the highway one time and I got pulled over. And once again, I was different. I have expressed deference. I was respectful. I know to have my hands obvious at all times. I know to tell a police officer if I'm opening my glove box to get out my insurance information or whatever. So you're treated very differently. Somebody else going the same, like a young male, going the same amount over the speed limit as I was at that point would have had a very different outcome. Okay, let's look at we are looking at symbolic interactionism here. Police use stereotypes on deciding who to arrest. The more a suspect matches their idea of a dangerous criminal, the more likely the police are to arrest, and that's police discretion. That's what I asked you a minute ago. Do they have to pull you over if your plates are expired? No. Do they have to pull you over if your taillight is out? No, they don't have to. That's police discretion. Okay. But if they do pull you over and you're look like me or some other kind of respectable, white person, particularly older, they're just going to say, ma'am, did you know your taillight was out? Well, you better get that fixed. very different outcome than we've seen with a lot of those kinds of situations, particularly in the last couple of years. So, once again, the more a suspect matches the idea of a dangerous criminal, the more likely they are to arrest. And that's police discretion. What about cautioning here about crime statistics? The facts of social problems are not objective. They're produced within a social context. For example, working class boys are much more delinquent than middle class boys. Why? Because they're arrested more often and show up in official crime statistics. So if you look at any official crime statistics about delinquency, you're going to see that middle class and upper middle class young men have a much lower crime rate than poorer adolescent males, okay? Because they're not arrested as often. It doesn't mean they're committing less crime, okay? So let's look at functionalism now. Functionalism says crime and society's core values go together. They're a natural, crime is a natural part of society, and it can reflect the core values of society in that society requires well-trained, educated professionals like dentists, lawyers, teachers, etc., right? So you must have high ability and diligence. We, in society, locate, and train the most talented people, and that society has to motivate everyone to strive for success, which creates intense competition. Obviously, only some people make it. And so we have this idea that of attaining the American dream, regardless of race, ethnicity, sex, social class, origin, etc. That's kind of our founding myth. Okay. What does that have to do with crime? That founding myth of a meritocracy, that if you deserve it, you'll make it, and no matter who you are, etc. Well, what it has to do with crime is that we're all socialized into the goal of success and the American dream. But the playing field isn't equal, as we're told it is, okay? Some people have more, and groups have more resources than others. So most of us want success in whatever area we dream of having success in, but not everyone's able to attain that, or to succeed, or in some cases even to survive well. And that creates strain. And out of that, we get the strain theory. There's a table in your book on the strain theory. So we're going to go through it. If you don't feel the strain, so you're doing fine, you're got plenty of money, good education, etc. You don't feel the strain, that leads to what's called anomie. Anomie, A-N-O-M-I-E, it's in your text, means a time of kind of normlessness, when nothing is working the way it's supposed to. War is a really good example of anomie. Children who are never a danger, who you protect, might be, in Iraq or Afghanistan, might be carrying an IED, for instance. You just don't know. You don't know what's happening. All the norms are gone. That's anomie. Okay. So you're told this thing like, we can all succeed, we can all attain the American dream. And if that works for you, and your family of origin can propel you along that path, you don't feel a heck of a lot of strain about that, right? Or anomie. And therefore, your mode of adaptation is conformity, because it's working for you. You conform to those things. You accept cultural goals of climbing the ladder and going to college and getting a degree or an advanced degree and becoming successful. You accept the institutionalized means, which is going to college, etc., getting a good job, becoming a professional. But if you do feel the strain, right? If all of that isn't working for you, or it's not possible to do it that way, the conventional conforming way. There are various ways that you adapt. Adapt. Okay, so the first one, if you feel the strain, is innovation. With innovation, you accept the cultural goals. Yes, I want a nice house and a car and a lot of money and status and all of that stuff. That's the cultural goals. But you reject the institutional ways to get them. Okay? If you can't get it the legitimate way, going to college, getting a degree, getting a good job, buying a house, all that stuff, then you're going to get it through illegitimate means. Okay? And illegitimate means is going to be theft. It's all kinds of things, right? But, that type of thing. Now, another reaction to feeling the strain of not attaining the full American dream in the legitimate way is called ritualism. With ritualism, you reject the cultural goals of all of that stuff, but you accept the institutional means. What does that mean? It means you've given up on achieving success. The bureaucrat who plugs along in lower management for 30 years and gets a watch when he retires. Nobody does that anymore, but that used to be the main example. Okay, you give up on achieving success. It's never going to happen. But you do just enough to say, for example, to not get fired from your job for 30 years. You just keep plugging along. That's ritualism. The ritual is you keep ritually going to your job and doing something. Retreatism, you reject both the goals of society, the making an American dream, and the way to achieve it. And retreatism, the examples are often drug addicts, street addicts, people who enter convents in some way. I'm not sure that's a really good example, but that's one example that's given. Another one might be people who, there are people who are, they have institutionalized personalities. They don't want to get out of jail. They don't know what to do out there because they've retreated from the real world into whatever it is. And then the last form, if you feel strain, is called rebellion. And that also rejects both the conventional means of getting there and the goals. And so you replace societal goals, you rebel. So the 1960s and the countercultural revolution of, I don't want to be like my father. Take this job and shove it. I want to change the world and change society, and I don't want to plug along at some stupid job. The war resistance movement was an example exactly of this rebellion, of rejecting the goals of militarism and trying to find another way. So those are the ways. Innovation, that first one, is the way, that is the response that relates to crime. You want those very expensive sneakers, so you're going to go steal them. You accept the goal of the very expensive sneakers, but you're not going to plug away at some stupid job to get them. You're going to steal them. Okay, do you understand how that works? Okay, good. So let's look at social class and illegitimate opportunities right now. So with the strain theory, it explains why there's so many poor people who commit burglaries and robberies. They want the stuff that society says you should have, but they don't have the conventional way of getting there through the institutional means. So society encourages poor people, along with everybody else, to want material success. And education is the primary way to do that. Education is the primary way to fulfill the American dream. And that works great for middle-class kids, generally. Often, though, it's real culture shock for children from working-class parents. There are very strict rules applied to, as you know, educational endeavors, and proper speech is expected. Grammar is important. Um, uh, the ability to spell, all those can compute, all those kinds of things. Grammar and profanity often mark working class and poor kids from middle class kids. Most important, because they go to terribly inferior schools. Remember, the neighborhood you live in America depends, and most places depends on your economic status, right? And poor neighborhoods have poor schools, and I mean poor in terms of lack of money and also poor education, not as good teachers, etc., not enough textbooks, not enough technology with computers and things. Why? Because we fund our education in our schools through property taxes. The only country I know that does that. And it creates these really, you can, if you live in Lake Oswego, Oregon, those public schools are like private schools. But you go to a poor community and that's not true at all. Okay. So what happens is those things, not understanding how the system works, maybe just not having a place to study at home, language, grammar, how who you are understood to be by your presentation of self with those things like language and grammar, etc., are barriers to success in America. They certainly can be. And there's a very high dropout rate for working class students. In colleges especially, there's a very high dropout rate. And then what happens is often a different door opens, and that's what are called illegitimate opportunity structures. And they're kind of woven into the reality of life, particularly in urban slums, ghettos and barrios and places like that. Robbery, burglary, drug dealing, prostitution, pimping, gambling, hustler players. Those are all the hustler, the pimp, they're all role models for success in many cultural, environmental situations. Now, the middle and upper classes have crime too, but they're different illegitimate opportunity structures, okay? Different forms of crime that are functional for middle and upper classes, things like insider trading. Something is going to be legislated to affect a particular corporation, so you can either buy the stocks or get out of there fast if you're privy to that. And Bernie Madoff and his Ponzi scheme of investors that he just kept their money and never really invested it, and people lost millions in all their retirement income. That's an upper middle class kind of crime. So to sum it up, the functionalists view property crime inherent in societies that socialize people of all classes to desire material success when the legitimate means to get that success are limited. Okay? Now, the conflict theory, as you might imagine, takes a different approach, and what he says is that the whole criminal justice system and concept and laws are extremely unfair and unjust. The example that is given is the Sioux Manufacturing Corporation in North Dakota that manufactured Kevlar, which is the fabric that deflects shrapnel and bullets. So they manufactured, the Sioux Manufacturing Company in North Dakota, manufactured the helmets for troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they used, to save money and make a greater profit, they used less Kevlar than they were supposed to for the protection of the soldiers and the endangered U.S. troops, and possibly causing some to die. And the accusation was true. There's doctored records to show that the company had used the correct amount. but they were doctored. They didn't use the correct amount. And there was no punishment for the crime. No executives spent any time in jail. None of them were even put on trial. The company paid a minimal fine compared to the value of the company. The government gave them another contract to make more helmets, if you can believe that. Now, contrast this corporation's non-liability, nothing really happened to them at all, with poor people caught stealing $5,000 and sent to prison for years, or someone who voted accidentally, not knowing that it was illegal to vote if you were on parole, like that woman recently who got 5 years in prison. Okay, so let's look at power and social class and the inequality in the legal system. The basis of inequality and power in a capitalist society is the division between what's called the ruling class, or the owners of the means of production, and the working class. Okay? So the working class is divided into 3 groups. The upper level managers and professionals, they have secure positions and they're paid very, very, very well, like CEOs and things of that nature. The second level is called the stable working class. Those are white and blue collar workers whose jobs they're less secure and they're paid less, but they're paid enough for survival, and they're stable. The jobs are secure enough that they're not frantically worried constantly about being laid off or something. And then the marginal working class, they have little or no job security, and they're also people on welfare. And it's called a reserve labor market. In a capitalist society, you always want to keep a group of people, a certain percentage, that are desperate, in a sense, as a reserve labor market. That if you need to hire more people, they're there, okay? So most of the people who are, burglars, muggers, armed robbers, and car thieves come from that, what's called the marginal working class. They may work occasionally. They're last hired, first fired. You've heard that terminology. That's the marginal working class. So the conflict theory emphasizes, and by the way, that's based on research, that most burglars, muggers, armed robbers, and car thieves come from that particular class of people, marginal working class. The conflict theory emphasizes that law is not the ideal that we learn about. It's not impartial justice. Rather, it's an entity, the law, that the ruling class uses to maintain its privileged position. However, the ruling class violations can't be totally ignored. So every once in a while, there's some fairly mild repercussions, and which are done from a conflict perspective. Remember, these are 3 different perspectives. So you're not, this is the conflict perspective, right? So the reason that there are occasionally people like Martha Stewart who goes to jail for 6 months because of insider trading, or people go to those country club prisons. She went to a country club prison. This is the reason they do bust these people occasionally, is done to prevent revolutions and uprisings, and those types of things. Very few wealthy white collar criminals appear in court. Most appear before the Federal Trade Commission, which has no power to imprison, like the Kevlar people. And those commissions are headed by those in positions of power and privilege, so they're equals coming before equals, and most receive very small fines, if any. So to sum it up with the conflict theory, the criminal justice system is actually a system to maintain the status quo and keep those in power there. Okay, now we're going to look at types of crime, and we're going to look at juvenile delinquency, white-collar crime, professional crime, and organized crime. So first is juvenile delinquency. So our concept of children in the modern world is very different than it was historically in the Western world, at any rate, which is children used to be, we're talking about 100 plus years ago, they were just small adults, right? The idea of adolescence, remember we're looking at juvenile delinquency here, is really a socially constructed time. And there are other cultures that don't have any idea of, they don't even have a word for adolescent. You know, you're a child, you go through a puberty ceremony, now you're an adult, in many indigenous cultures. So the idea of adolescence is socially constructed, and the things that we associate with it are often socially constructed as well. Out of that concept of adolescence came the idea or the concept of juvenile delinquency. So let's look at the extent of juvenile crime. And there are things called status crimes. Status crimes mean they're only a crime because of the status of the person committing them. In this case, a juvenile. So running away from home is a status crime. Drinking, underage drinking is a status crime. Your status is that you're not old enough to drink legally. Violating age curfew is a status crime. But of course, those crimes aren't what bother people, are they, about juvenile delinquency? The primary concerns are actual crimes, and the actual crimes and the rate at which juveniles perpetrate them is in a graph on page 151, I believe. So here's how a delinquent career unfolds based on sociological research. The first step is after the first arrest, the majority, almost 60%, never return to juvenile court. So one time is the lesson, that's it for 60% of juveniles who get arrested. 2, the juveniles who are most likely to recommit are those arrested a second time before the age of 16. That's interesting, isn't it? 3, those charged with a violent crime are likely to have already committed many crimes. 4, the younger you are, or one is, when first charged with a violent crime, the greater the likelihood to be charged with subsequent violent crimes. So those charged at 13 years of age with a violent crime are twice as likely to be charged again as those who were first charged at 16. That's also extremely interesting, I think. 5, those most likely to be arrested are those whose first charge was burglary, truancy, motor vehicle theft, or robbery. The least likely to be rearrested, are those whose first charge was underage drinking, running away, or shoplifting. So 2 of those are status crimes, right? Underage drinking and running away. Shoplifting is an actual crime. And 7, girls are less likely to be rearrested than boys. Okay, or males and females. The recent change to this dynamic is that young women have greater involvement in crime now than they used to. Okay, that's been increasing over the last few years. So that's a remarkable change, actually. Since 1981, girls' arrests for both property and violent crime doubled. So that's quite a big change. All right. There's something called neutralizing devices, which keeps one from feeling guilt about things that one does. These are, by the way, neutralizing devices relating specifically to crime, but they are used in all kinds of situations by all kinds of people. You'll see as we go through them, not just juveniles and not just in relating to crime, but that's how it's being specifically applied here. So the first one is denial of responsibility. Oh gosh, it was something beyond my control that happened. Other people were involved and I had to do whatever I did. Okay. The second one is denial of injury. You admit the act was illegal, but you didn't really hurt anybody. It doesn't hurt. This is a famous one for shoplifting, right? that store has so much money. It doesn't. Yeah, I took it, but it didn't really hurt anybody that I stole that sweater or whatever. 3 is the denial of a victim. Even if they did harm, it wasn't wrong under the circumstances. I thought they were going to do something violent, or I was getting even for something they previously did. 4, condemnation of the condemned. Everybody does that. I just got caught, but they're hypocrites. They do it too, right? And 5th is appeal to higher loyalty. This is with gangs a lot, of course, that the friends are more important than the law. So now let's look at education and delinquency. This is a great quote. If we can keep them in school, we can keep them out of trouble. If they drop out, they're lost. And it's one of the rare times that common sense, that statement that I just made, if we can keep them in school, we can keep them out of trouble. If they drop out, they're lost. That's kind of common sense. So this is one of the rare times that common sense and sociological research agree. Those who graduate from high school, those are much less likely to commit crimes. Almost half, 40 to 46% of those in prisons and jails did not complete high school. And of course, keeping people in prison costs much more to society and our tax dollars than does the cost of education, particularly K through 12 education. So the study in California that they talk about, each high school graduate saves the state $32,000 and crime victims about $80,000. And over a lifetime, each high school graduate generates about $500,000 in benefits to the government. That's taxes and a variety of other things. And then there's a box about urban gangs you can read about there in the chapter. So now we're going to look at white-collar crime and corporate crimogenic cultures. Don't you like that term, crimogenic? And white-collar crimes are crimes committed by people of respectable and high social status in the course of their occupation. That includes things like automobile companies knowingly producing cars with mechanical defects. There's a story and some photos in there about that Ford Motor Company with a Pinto automobile, which the gas tank would explode on a rear collision if it was hit from the rear, but it didn't have to be a big, heavy-duty, high-speed collision. Just small bumps would make it explode, and some people were killed, others were burned horribly in that. For Firestone Tires and Ford again, they served on each other's boards of directors, and Firestone made a deal and put Firestone tires on Ford Broncos, and they were defective tires and would blow out at high speeds. And those are what they mean by that kind of crime. High status, white collar crime. I mean, big corporations partake in white collar crime. Drug companies altering data to keep dangerous or ineffectual drugs on the market. Opioid epidemic and that family that did that and runs that show. So corporations can, not all of them, but they can create this crimogenic culture, one that encourages and supports the commission of crime. So let's look at white-collar crimes that kill. I mentioned the Firestone, all of those 3, the opioids, the Pinto, the Firestone tires, but here's others. Ballpark Franks, they stopped testing for listeria, which is a deadly disease, and 15 people died. No one went to prison for that. Sara Lee pled guilty to 2 misdemeanors and paid a fine. They must be the people who Sara Lee must own Ballpark Franks. The exploding Pinto, I talked about that one. The Olds Cutlass, the gas tank ruptured. The company knew. They found a memorandum that the company knew about it. In 1998, a 13-year-old boy burned to death It would have cost $4.50 a car to fix the problem. But the cost of the lawsuits would be only $2.40 a car. So they didn't fix them. And that's what's called a cost benefit analysis. How much does it cost to fix the problem and save people's lives? And how much does it cost to just pay them off or pay the whatever the lawsuit is awarded, the case awards? And in this case, and in the Pinto case, and I think the Firestone and Ford Bronco case, it cost less to pay people for the pain and suffering and death than it did to redo the whole car thing and the assembly line and the parts and all of that. What about cigarette companies? Okay. And that's another example. So all of that we just talked about with white collar crime really confirms the perspective of conflict theorists, which is that the powerful do manipulate the legal system. They can and do escape punishment, and they can commit what's called serial manslaughter with impunity. So, certainly cigarette companies is serial manslaughter for many, 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 many years, with lung cancer in particular. What about embezzlement? Here's a classic study of embezzlement. Okay. The people who are embezzlers are likely, this is from research in the study, they feel that they have an unshareable financial problem. They have something going on financially they don't want to tell anybody about. Okay, that's the unshareable part. And they also neutralize their crime with those same things that we saw with the juvenile delinquents. Everybody does it, they can afford it, that type of thing. They think in their heads that they intend to pay it back when they embezzle, but they rarely, if ever, do, of course. And although they're stealing, because embezzlement is stealing, they still consider themselves to be respectable and law-abiding. What about employment theft? Employment theft, of course, is stealing the things that the company sells or manufactures, and that is just rampant from, envelopes and stamps. Well, nobody uses those anymore, but you know what I mean. I don't know what, ink for your printer, that type of thing. But they also steal company secrets. So that happens as well. So that's the first part of the chapter, and the second lecture will cover the second half.